we want everybody to feel completely free to say whatever they need to say. First, I'll just say a little bit about why we're all here today. So thanks for joining this roundtable event to discuss how we can make job sharing work in the UK post-COVID. My name is Sian Sutherland. I'm co-founder of A Plastic Planet. I'm an entrepreneur and a campaigner, and I sit on the board of Empower, and I'll be chairing the discussion today. Before we move on to introductions, I wanted to briefly share the context surrounding this event. Firstly, an introduction to Empower. Empower is a strategic communications practice working to promote organisations, women and men, who are reshaping the rules to promote female empowerment. Empower is chaired by former Home Secretary Jackie Smith. This year, we wanted to focus our campaigning efforts on a cause that we've been passionate about for a long time, but is now more important than ever: job sharing. We believe job sharing is a vital, flexible working practice that will promote gender equality at work and help close the gender pay gap. With the corona pandemic seeing a shift in working patterns across the country, women's jobs have been vastly, disproportionately impacted. Women are almost twice as likely as men to have lost their jobs. A third of working mothers reported having lost work or hours due to a lack of childcare during this time. The impact this has made on the gender pay gap is still not 100% clear, but we are at risk of reversing the progress made so far. We believe job sharing has a clear place in the post-COVID world of work. Demand for flexible work is growing. More than 9 in 10 working parents and carers want their workplace to retain flexible working, and job sharing allows for this flexibility without impacting career progression, all whilst offering clear benefits to employers. Yet many employers see it as cost prohibitive, and much of the working population either doesn't know that job shares are an option or don't feel comfortable requesting them. We're here today to discuss these points and to get your expert perspective on why job sharing is important for gender equality and what we can do to make it a widely available working practice. Before we get started, it would be great to hear from each of you now, introducing yourselves and the organisation that you're representing today. And we have good times, so please take this opportunity to take a few minutes to say a little bit about why you're here as well and why you're interested in this subject. Let me start going around the room and start with Dame Margaret Hodge, Labour MP for Barking.
Thank you very much, Sean. John, I'm here because I've been campaigning on this issue for, I'm trying to think how long, over 30 years. And I'm going to start by sharing a very funny story, which goes back to when I was first elected as an MP, which was in 1994. So it was a long time ago. And I was quite naive in those days. And I went out for lunch with a journalist from the Sunday Times and talked to her, said that I saw no reason why we shouldn't have job sharing for MPs. And it was just a sort of off the record discussion. So I found it quite prominent in the Sunday Times the following Sunday with a picture of me. And on the Monday, I went back into the House of Commons and was hauled in by the whips into their office and found the picture of me had been taken out of the Sunday Times, stuck onto a board, and they were putting darts into it. And the message that I was given was, if I didn't like the terms of the job, I should give up and go away because there were plenty of other people who wanted to do it. It's a sort of terrible story, really, but I'm not sure things have moved on so much. And I just want to make three points. First of all, I think we've got to really distinguish between job share and part-time working. And it's important to make the distinction between that because, more and more people work part-time, but actually part-time working stops you getting promoted very often. So you do it because it fits in with your caring responsibilities, but it often limits your promotional prospects. And also very often as a part-timer, you're expected to do still the productivity of a full-time work. So if you reduce your hours by day, you're still expected to do 5 days a week. And I think the great thing about job sharing is it does facilitate promotion. And I think we should see it in that context. It's very important, I think, to continue to sort of argue for, what do we do about it? We'll probably come to that later, Sian. And then obviously, all my experience of where I've seen job sharing over time is there are benefits to both employer and employee. You get double as much commitment from 2 people job sharing as you do from 1 person. And also the sort of relationship between the 2 individuals is very different than from 2 part-timers working perhaps in the same context, whether it's in a classroom or elsewhere. It's just a much more integrated approach. So I think there are massive benefits to the employer. And I think it's empowering for individuals because there's a sort of, you can, bounce ideas off each other. You can, there's much more creativity that takes place if you're in a job sharing context than not. So I'm here really because I've been campaigning on this for a very long time, and I don't think things have moved off enough, but I see it very much as a career progression capability as much as enabling all the other things about flexibility that you referred to in your opening comments.
Great, thank you very much, Margaret. And I feel like if things are going to change, now is the time. We are ready for a new kind of normal in so many different ways. And I think this could be a real catalyst for us all working in a different way. So it's great that everybody's come together to discuss it. I'm moving on now to Hannah Essex, who is Co-Executive Director at the British Chambers of Commerce.
Thank you, Sian. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm, as you said, I'm Co-Exec Director at the British Chambers of Commerce. I share that role with Claire Walker. And I'll talk a bit more about that. I'm also a reception and year 2 teacher at the moment. So if you see small people in the background, that's because they're at home with me at the moment. So I think Claire and I were reflecting the other day how interesting it is that as soon as you take away the infrastructure that allows women to work, it suddenly becomes a lot harder, and we're both experiencing that at the moment. And I may also move at some point because I'm allowed to have the office at 11:30, so bear with me if I start moving around the house. So I've been job sharing with Claire for 6 years. I grew up not really expecting to have children. I thought that it was a choice between career or children. I didn't see anyone in my life who did both. And actually it came, when I did have children, job sharing to me was the obvious and the only way in which I could actually continue with my career and maintain the level that I had achieved at that point, and also progress in my career. And through my partnership with Claire, I've been able to do that, and talk a bit more about that as the session goes on. But I work for the British Chambers of Commerce. Chambers of Commerce represent 70-odd thousand businesses around the United Kingdom, and when we have a global network around the world. And we found in the 2.5 years we've been here that the top issue that businesses want to speak to us about is people and skills, and how do we get the best people to make our business successful. And one of the ways to do that is to adopt a more flexible approach to work, and release those untapped pools of talent, and working women in particular, mothers who want to work. Flexible working is absolutely essential to allow them to have that balance between work and family. But also we need more men to be embracing that opportunity, to be working more flexibly, to be demanding to work more flexibly, and to be job sharing, in order to make sure that it becomes something that is for everybody. And something that becomes much more normal, and not just something that's sort of a track that you put women on because they choose to have children. So I'm very passionate about job sharing. We've supported a lot of job sharers over the years. We found there wasn't much out there to tell you how to do it when we set out. In fact, there was a Capability Jane report, which was our first sort of go-to for how to do it. But then actually it's learning from others is how we've managed to sort of develop and hone the way that we do it. And I look forward to telling you more about that.
Great, thank you very much, Hannah. Actually, living the dream. And you make such a good point that we can't make this just about women. That men should have absolutely equal right to have this new way of working as well. I'm going to move around the room to Claire McCartney, who is Diversity and Inclusion Advisor at the CIPD.
Brilliant, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yep, so I represent the CIPD, which is the professional body for HR and people development. And one of our key aims is to improve work and working lives. And, you know, for us, flexibility and flexible working is at the core of that. We think that it should be the norm, not the exception, for all UK workers, and it's central to inclusive and productive workplaces. And we think there can be much greater fairness and opportunities for all. And we're going to launch a campaign actually at the beginning of next month around asking the government to change the right to request flexible working to become a day one right. It's currently 26 weeks. I mean, that's only part of the change that's needed, but we think this might be a really good opportunity to move the agenda forward and actually also ask our members and employers to adopt that, and also to start recruiting flexibly as well, and tagging their recruitment advertisements happy to talk flexible working. So all of that, you know, really important. What we're finding from our research is that organisations are obviously much more open now to allowing home working, and that can be flexible and that can be really beneficial, but sometimes home working isn't that flexible. But actually what we're finding is that there's less flexibility in the physical workspace. There's less organisations being creative in terms of what they're offering, such as job shares, such as compressed hours, such as, you know, flexible start and finish time. So we want to see greater flexibility, because otherwise we might start to have a bit of a two-tier system where, you know, some people have got flexibility because they've got the ability to work from home, and others in the physical workspace, often, you know, our frontline workers or often low paid workers, have very little flexibility, or if it is, it's one-way flexibility, so more like, you know, kind of 0-hour contracts rather than the organisation being flexible with them. So yeah, so that's our point of view.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. It's really interesting to hear a little bit more about your campaign, perhaps how Empower can help support you on that. I'm moving now around to Charlotte Woodworth, who is Gender Equality Campaign Director at BTC.
Hi there, lovely to be here. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, very clearly.
Hiya, so I'm Gender Equality Campaigns Director at Business in the Community. We are the UK's largest and oldest responsible business network, and in a nutshell, what we try and do is work with big employers, big business, big public sector departments that are committed to doing business better, to taking an ethical and responsible approach. And I have the rather plum job of working with employers who are looking to do everything from close their pay gaps, get more women in senior levels, ensure greater diversity among their workforce, and very much try and do that through peer learning and kind of challenging and provoking people to try and do better. A couple of just extra thoughts I'd add, given what others have said, and to help kind of ground where I'm coming from in this conversation. I very much agree that now is the moment to be talking about job shares and flexible work design. We know that many different employers are thinking about job design from the ground up in the context of what's happened around COVID. So it seems like a great moment to try and embed a kind of shifted attitude. I think it's important that when we talk about the impacts of the pandemic and the potential that the pay gap might widen, that we attach quite a strong health warning to that, because the majority of the women that have lost their jobs have been in low paid sectors. There could be a situation where actually the pay gap seems to indicate a better healthiness in the workplace than is really the case. And I'm quite concerned that the kind of narrative around that recognises that, and that we don't, as people championing gender equality, say, if the gender pay gap moves or stays the same, everything's okay, or we're still in the right track. Actually, we could see it close, but that'd be for very bad reasons. And then a final thought I'd just add is, in the pandemic, and as we've all tried to adapt to this new way of working, I and others, many of you around the table, have been trying to champion gender equality in a way that I think has seen us try and support women to do it all, try and enable women to do it all. So one of the big things that I've been saying to employers is, make sure you take advantage of the furlough scheme, make sure you offer additional paid leave, so those women can almost step away from work during this period and then come back afterwards. And I'm a little bit concerned that in our response to the crisis, if we're not careful, we might consolidate a kind of expectation that women try and do it all, and that women are the ones that bear that brunt. And so we at the ITC have been saying to employers, this is the moment for you to be calling on the men in your workforce to step forward and pick up additional care and responsibilities. If you've been struggling with a low take-up of shared parental leave, your choices in the here and now are going to see that improve in the next year if you really enable men in your network to step forward. And I just think that's something for us to have in the back of our minds when we think about the gendered lens on job sharing, but also the way in which we try to address the pandemic has kind of rough and smooth. Finally, on a personal note, I work 4 days a week. I have a 3.5-year-old, and when I look to the future, I'd love to job share. I think that's the only way I can really see it working in the next sort of how many years, and really keen to learn from everything around the table.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. One of the points really resonates with me, the whole thing of we can make numbers lie to ourselves. It depends what those metrics are. And when you're looking at things like the pay gap, we have to make sure that we're looking at true numbers. And I also love your reference to this is a moment to call on men. And if we shine a media spotlight on the problems that this is causing women, then we perpetuate that because we're giving that oxygen and air. And there is an opportunity for us to focus on perhaps showcasing the men that are doing things differently so that it doesn't just become a female issue. I love all of those insights. And finally, Caroline, I know that you were wearing 2 hats just then. Hopefully you're free now. So I'd love to turn to Caroline Noakes, Conservative MP for Romsey and Southampton North.
Thank you so much, Sian. And that's one of the joys of a virtual chamber, is that I can be speaking in the House 1 minute and actually back in this room the next. And I know there are those dinosaurs in the House, and Margaret spoke of them earlier, who don't want to see us have change and don't want there to be progress. But I think what we have learned through the pandemic is that you can have a functioning parliament. It's not brilliant, it's not perfect, but we're on a learning curve, aren't we? And it is a phenomenal way to demonstrate that you can work from home effectively, chairing select committees, holding the government to account, scrutinising what ministers are doing. And that's all part of the picture about how we can work more flexibly going forward. I felt a little shamed by Margaret, who has been working in this space for an incredibly long time. And I always say, as chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee for the last year, I feel that I'm rather late to the party. And what I have learned over the course of the last year, and it does come through the prism of the pandemic, is that we're at a real, I think, a really crucial point for particularly female employment. And I know that there's been rightly some emphasis this morning about this cannot be gendered. This has to be for men as well as women, and we will be reliant upon men to step up and champion this. But you would expect the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee to look at this from a gendered perspective. And we have spent, what is coming very close now to a year, running an inquiry into the gendered economic impact of COVID. That is absolutely at its conclusion, and I can't trail anything from the report, but I can tell you that I did the chair's amends to it just yesterday. So I've seen the recommendations, and I can point to the evidence that we took throughout the course of the inquiry, and the evidence that showed us very clearly that as we went into the pandemic at the start of last year, female employment was at a record high. We were doing relatively well. The gender pay gap, now that I think that's a really fascinating argument we've heard about that this morning, because although reporting has been suspended, I was always very keen to emphasise when people started crowing that you could see that the movement was in the right direction. The gender pay gap is a snapshot at any one time. And so actually without constant action, you don't keep improving upon it. There will come no point, even when the gender pay gap is 0, that is not a point to sit back and rest on your laurels, because it can very easily, through all sorts of circumstances, start headed back in the wrong direction. We very much hope as a committee, and I'm sure as Parliament, that we're going to see an employment bill come forward pretty soon. I think that's crucially important for everybody, but specifically very important for women. And from my perspective, not just as a select committee chair, but as a backbencher, you suddenly discover, sort of freed from the shackles of ministerial office, how much you can actually get done and how much you can get done through cross-party working. And I know it sort of strikes fear into people's hearts when they hear that me and Harriet Harman are cooking something up on female employment rights to be part of that employment bill when we see it. But it's absolutely the way that you bring about sustainable, lasting change. I feel quite sad when Margaret points out that she's been fighting since the 1990s for change in Parliament. And I always say I arrived in 2010, having assumed that I would find a Parliament that was respectful, that treated members equally. And I discovered that I'd been lumped into a boys' prep school where the inmates hadn't quite got to 13. And I think it's better now than it was just 11 years ago. And I'm sure it's a great deal better now than it was in the 1990s, but there's still a massive, massive way to go. So I think, and maybe this is the true optimist in me, I think we have to use the pandemic as an opportunity. And it's very seldom that you hear people saying anything positive about it. This has shone a really bright light on employment practices. It's shone an incredibly bright light on the fact that it is women who have, and I really hate to say borne the brunt, carried the greatest share of the responsibility for childcare. And that's just the fact they have. And we have to find ways going forward that flexible working and job share can work for everybody, and not just those of us who might be working in jobs already where it's perfectly possible to work from home, but for those who have been working on the front line throughout the pandemic, for those who have been juggling childcare responsibilities when they've been key workers and finding it difficult to get childcare, when they're being prioritised in schools according to which type of key worker you are for those spaces, and are both parents key workers or is it just one? And I think there is a long way to go yet, but it's great this morning, nearly this afternoon, to be part of the conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline. And we're definitely going to come back to that employment bill and just see what opportunities there are there. And of course, in all of your incredible introductions, unsurprisingly, you have covered a huge amount of ground already, but I thought it might be useful for us to go back and perhaps flesh out a little bit more of some of the issues that you have all already raised. So the first question I'm going to pose is this: the coronavirus pandemic has seen a shift in working patterns across the country. In particular, women have taken the brunt of childcare responsibilities. How many stories have I heard about that? Apart from John Higginson, of course, who's taken absolutely his fair share of childcare responsibilities in their household. Haven't you, John? So this has meant that many have left the workforce or reduced their hours. What risk does this pose to the progress that has been made towards closing the gender pay gap? And I'd love to first invite contributions from Caroline and also from Dame Margaret to see if you can just flesh that out a little bit more. And anybody else on this panel, please do dive in with anything that you want to add. Margaret.
Thanks for that. Oh, we'll go to Margaret first.
I think actually Caroline first, because you've taken all this evidence on it. So, I mean, if you're allowed to share that with us, I know it's difficult to share the conclusions of the Select Committee report, but I think sharing the evidence would be really, really helpful.
Thank you for that, Margaret. And I make the point repeatedly that we take the evidence in public, so therefore I can talk about it as much as I like. Can't share our recommendations as yet, but certainly the evidence that we took focused very heavily around childcare responsibilities. And I think that's, I'm always very careful that I don't just want to get bogged down in talking about childcare and homeschooling, because this is a much bigger issue than that, but it has been very, very significant. And we know from the evidence that we took that women were carrying by far the largest share of childcare. And we also heard across many sectors that it was women who were making difficult decisions about whether they were staying in the workforce. Many were in sectors that were in complete shutdown. So we know that 58% of all retail workers are female, and they were really struggling as non-essential retail shut completely. We know that it wasn't until the second lockdown that women were entitled to say to their employer that they wanted to be furloughed specifically for childcare responsibilities. And some of some of the evidence that we were taking was a very mixed picture on furlough, with some women indicating that it had been much harder for them than their male colleagues to be furloughed. And I think the picture on redundancies, which is still trickling through, very clearly indicates that it's kind of a female first strategy. Now, we all know that that's illegal, but the reality is when you're looking at companies that are having large numbers of redundancies, it's much easier to disguise that. So I think from the committee's perspective, we're going to be making a large number of recommendations to the employment bill, or to the DWP, hoping to see it come forward in the employment bill. And quite a lot of emphasis around, look, this is a bill that was promised in the manifesto. Now, look, we all accept COVID got in the way, but we still don't really have any indication of when that bill will come forward. And I don't think we can keep waiting for it. And I'm conscious that this is being recorded, although only being used internally and not shared. I'm very worried. We took evidence from the Secretary of State for International Trade, also the Minister for Women and Equalities, right at the start of the inquiry. And I don't even think she necessarily was giving evidence to the inquiry. It was our sort of get to know Liz Truss session. But it did happen at the beginning of the pandemic. And it was, I would say, quite worrying. And she kept pointing repeatedly to what a great opportunity it was to learn that we could all work from home, without very much recognition that this is sectorally based. And the reality is that if you're a nurse or a retail worker, or you're working in the hospitality industry or in hair and beauty, you cannot work from home. You have to go and interact with your clients. And I do welcome some of the comments that she made very recently, back in December, about widening the breadth of the Government Equalities Office and being able to look at socioeconomic inequalities. I think that's great. And we were very quick as a committee to check that her widening the remit of the office also widened the remit of our committee, because it's often a criticism that we get that the committee can only look at the work of the GEO, which is limited to the protected characteristics. Well, if she wants to widen it, great, we'll get stuck right in. But I think there were also some very, very challenging comments that she made about opportunity. And I think we have to be completely realistic, and apologies to the gentleman on the call, but women have been fighting for an awfully long time to get the rights that we currently have. I will not see them eroded, and I will not see a drive to level up the country come at the expense of women and those with other protected characteristics. And I always say this: if we wish to have a focus on levelling up, and if we wish that focus to be in the northeast, can we also please think of parts of London, and I don't say London in the southeast, I say specifically London, where you have the greatest disparity of income, where you have very high numbers of BAME communities, very significant populations, yet they are hard up against extremely affluent areas. And we cannot forget them. We have to make sure that a levelling up agenda is not just geographic, but that it recognises that you have pockets of inequality all over the country. And so I welcome her determination to look at that, but I think it comes with a bit of a health check that we have to make sure that the traffic is in the right direction. I think there are some really interesting, and Margaret was busy educating me right at the start about the difference between part-time working and job sharing. And as I said, I am late to this, so I'm finding the whole discussion incredibly useful. But I think what really worries me is that part-time work is seen as less valuable. And we have to make sure that that cannot happen. And we also need to recognise throughout the pandemic, it is predominantly women who have been in part-time and insecure employment. And there have been all sorts of issues around access to statutory sick pay for people in insecure employment, about access to maternity pay and furlough as opposed to statutory sick pay as an alternative for employers right at the beginning of the pandemic. And these are all things which, I thought they were arguments that had been and gone decades ago, to be quite frank, and it feels incredibly uncomfortable to be revisiting them and having to revisit them now. But I think, just to conclude on the gender pay gap, and I said it in my introduction, having perhaps not paid enough attention to what order questions would come in today. Look, the gender pay gap, I always say, is a snapshot. I am particularly appalled that the gender pay gap went backwards in a number of government departments last year. I think that's just shameful, and most shameful of all that it went backwards in the Department for International Trade. I think there needs to be a greater focus from the government on equality and working out how they can continue to give a helping hand to those who are still fighting all these years on for their rights. So when we look at some of the programmes coming forward, whether it be Kickstart or STEM apprenticeships, then I'm certainly going to be pushing the government to say, well, look, let's set aside some of these programmes for a quota of women. And that will undoubtedly make me hideously unpopular in my own party. But I think it has to be done, because we will see female employment, which was at a record level. As I always tell people, the highest level in my lifetime back in March last year. And I really don't want us to see it go back to the 1970s.
Absolutely. I remember them well. Margaret, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, that is such a refreshing contribution, Caroline. So thanks for that. And I do think one of the things I've learned over over my years as an MP is that when you do get cross-party working, and the women have worked, I think, very effectively. I mean, one of the differences, Caroline, between now and 25 years ago is that there are more of us there. And the mere fact of our presence and our ability to work across party divides, I think, creates real change. I always say, actually, the right to flexible working was only ever introduced, because I was part of that movement, was only ever introduced against the resistance, if I dare say, of both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, because the women worked together, and it was both MPs, people in Number 10, and the policy people, and it was that joint working. So it's really, really important. That's the first thing. And the second thing to say is, I think this issue about never take your foot off the accelerator is so absolutely vital on all these gender issues. You think you've made progress and suddenly you find you've slipped backwards. And let me just raise an issue that hasn't actually been discussed, which is just maternity rights. If you look at statutory, I thought we'd dealt with that. I thought we'd solved that problem in my generation. And I now look at my children's generation, and this is another terrible story, but one of my daughters, they worked for a public authority, a local authority. They tried to make her redundant when she was on maternity leave. My daughter-in-law worked for a private sector, so that's a public sector. My daughter-in-law worked for a private sector company, and they actually gave her an offer she couldn't refuse the day before she had her first baby. And then my niece, who works for a voluntary organisation in London, had to have IVF treatment, and she lost her job because she took so much time off work to have the treatment. So there's a public sector, private sector, NGO sector examples today of people still being, so never take your foot off the accelerator. I mean, I'm trying to bring it back to job share because there are so many issues that we're talking about. And the other thing there was one other thing I wanted to say is I'm not sure, dare I say it, Caroline, I don't think you can, I can, you're not able to, but I will. Liz Truss wasn't talking about widening protected characteristics. She was talking about a change of focus. And I think we've all got to fight to ensure that it actually is an agenda of widening. And I'm all for bringing class in. And I agree so much about the inequality and the juxtaposition, particularly in large cities, of the very rich and the very poor. And the gross inequalities that brings in so many ways. But I don't think that's what all that was about. I wish it were. If we go back just to job share, if we can do that, I think, in terms of coming out of today, you've got to build the argument for it. I mean, am I right bringing it back to this, Sian? Are you happy for me to do that? You've got to build this argument for it. And I do think it's key about this, if we can distinguish, but part-time working is great because of the flexibility, but it's different. I think the real job share takes place at all levels, but the real benefit of it, and I don't know if people disagree with me, is that it means that you can move up the promotional ladder as you're balancing your life between your caring responsibilities and your desire to work. And that's what makes it so absolutely key. So can we agree that that is one of the reasons we're particularly interested in? Can we agree I think it brings in benefits to the employer and it empowers the individual. So if we can agree about that and build that argument, then how do we move that forward? And I think that there's very little monitoring of it. Do you know from the work you've done in Empower, or does anybody sitting around the table today know how much job sharing? I don't see that it become in any way a commonplace or
not remotely. People don't talk about it.
So we need to monitor it. And then my final point, which actually also speaks to something that Caroline says. Again, my experience over time is you never get change of this sort of radical nature without a sort of positive action targets setting tool. And much as we try to do, you can promote good examples, you can do all that sort of stuff, you can have lots of award ceremonies. You can do all those sort of culture change mechanisms that help to change the values and the way in which places of work operate. But actually, you do need that very hard tool of, you need to monitor, and you need some positive actions around targets and other positive action mechanisms. So I'd put those on the table.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And Claire, I could see you nodding emphatically throughout that. Did you want to add some comments?
Well, I was just going to say I did a slot on Women's Hour on job sharing. So we looked at the data, and our economists looked at it. And actually, for the most recent data from the ONS, suggested that 0.5% of people were in a job share, which is really low. Our other data that we'd collected previously in our survey showed about 2%. And in terms of how many employers offer it, about 87% of working adults say that job sharing was not available to them in their organisation. So I completely agree with you, Margaret. The figures are really low. And I just think there is a massive lack of awareness by organisations of the opportunities that job sharing presents, and also to some extent employees as well. And we just need to get, I mean, we can talk about this, but we need to get many more examples out there. We really need to raise awareness, because I completely agree in terms of the progression issue as well, that, you know, job sharing is a way to allow people to progress, to have great coverage of a role, better coverage of a role from two, you know, different people, and actually allow that progression, you know, which is what we want. So there are lots of opportunities there, but awareness is really low.
And just to add to that, the progression allows you also to tackle the pay gap.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, everything is connected. John, would you like to add any comments to that?
Yeah, so hi everyone, and just to introduce myself briefly, I'm John Higginson, one of the founders of Higginson Strategy. We're a communications agency that run Empower. We run it entirely ourselves and have been doing so for a few years. We've actually been looking at this issue for a couple of years now, and what really struck me as so strange when we started looking into this is, if you look at the vast bulk of job shares often come from an employee that the employer really likes, maybe going off and having a child, and then saying, I still want to work here. The employer says, we still want you. And then they have to go off and find someone else of equal ability to share their job. So that onus, as I'm sure Hannah will attest, is kind of entirely on the employee, and there's almost nothing on the employer. And I think there are some really easy wins in this area. For instance, at the moment, if you go on Indeed or Monster or Guardian Jobs or anything, you should, as an employer, I think, have a box that you tick saying, I do not accept job share. It'd be such a simple thing, and people could easily tick that box and say, no, I don't want to deal with job share. But you're just using a nudge there. And at the moment, if you're advertising a job and you're an employer and you don't know anything about job share, you think, oh God, that will be a whole headache of extra admin for me. Two people, what happens if I need to get rid of one of them and not the other? How does that all work? But when I heard Hannah's story originally, I suddenly thought, as an employer, we've only got a very small agency, 12 people. I thought, wow, I'd be able to get two people's experiences, two people's contacts for a very small increase, because if they're working 6 days overall, because you might say, well, we're both going to work on a Wednesday, so we can do handover. Suddenly you get access to those two people. So suddenly that went from being something that from an employer was a negative, trying to help out women and everything else, to actually you should really want this. And once that's explained to employers, you suddenly see this major benefit. So I'd just love to see that as a very easy carrot. If that was in legislation, that if you post an advert, you have to tick a box if you don't want job share, you would see those numbers massively increase. And I just looked on Indeed now onto job share. And as you pointed out, there's a very small number of jobs that you can get for job share. Quite often, if you want a job share job, there's one or two agencies that will search around for you, but they will only go to very progressive employees. The bulk of the jobs are in civil service and public sector. It has to be a really big organization usually to even consider it. But actually, an organization that's much smaller, that only has 12 employees or so should be thinking about it, but at the moment, bosses are seeing it as a whole load of extra admin and HR and all those kind of things.
Great, thank you, John. I completely agree that I think the business case has not really been discussed nearly enough, the upside for business. And we all know if it doesn't work for business, it's not going to work. And Margaret's already made the point that we need to focus not just on the human need, but also on the business need and the additional benefits that this new way of working could bring. I want to talk to the two people who are very, very involved at the coalface of this. So the second question is really looking at what the benefits of job sharing are as a flexible working arrangement, because we know now 65% of parents and carers are saying they'd like their future work arrangements to be extremely or very flexible. So Hannah and Charlotte, if I can invite you into the conversation to give some insights from your side of the fence.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just a couple of anecdotes, nothing as horrific as Dame Margaret's example. I don't know of anyone who's throwing darts at my picture. But the first time that Claire and I decided that we wanted to move on from, I'll tell you a bit about our story in a minute, but the first time we wanted to move on from our job as a partnership, we phoned up a recruiter and they were recruiting for an organisation that was about women. I won't go into any more detail than that, but we said, we've seen this role, we're really interested in it, we're an established job share partnership. Do you think that the organisation would consider appointing a job share into this role? And the recruiter's response was, oh, it's not something we've discussed, but my gut says no, but I will ask the question for you. Now, eventually they did ask the question and they were open to it, but it ended up not being the one for us. But that was our first experience of trying to talk to somebody about moving as a job share partnership. We also contacted a CV writer and said, we've got these two CVs that we need to bring together into one. And his response was, that's just not possible, that you cannot do that. So we've designed one ourselves, we've shared it with lots of people. People are now using our template for doing that, but it's we kept facing these constant sort of barriers of people just being completely baffled by the concept of job sharing. But actually what we found over time is there are huge benefits to us. You know, some of the benefits to me personally we've already talked about, the ability to maintain my career. I was a communications director. I didn't feel it was a job I could do part-time. I would have to have carved off a bit of it in order to carry on. So job sharing seemed to be the only way to keep that job, to return to that job after my maternity leave, and then to move on in my career, which we've done successfully. So Claire, I knew, we'd worked on a joint project together. She did my maternity leave, and then while I was on maternity leave, I actually called her about 3 weeks after I'd had my son and said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't come back to work. I'm never going to be able to do this. This is terrible. And she told me to calm down and go and look after my baby and we'd figure it out. And then a few months later, she called me and said, let's job share. And so, but like I said, there was very little information about how to do it. Our employer, fortunately, was very open to it, although in an organisation of 600 people, no one else had ever job shared. Actually, 600 people, of which 70% were women, no one else had ever job shared. And so we had to figure it out for ourselves. And what we found is that it's those two brains, you know, bringing two people together, two heads are better than one. Any of the biggest sort of tricky people issues or strategic issues we've ever come across, we've been able to figure out between us because we've been able to bounce things off each other. Quite often our best ideas come when we've had that 4 days away from the job and I come in on a Wednesday or Claire comes in on a Monday and says, actually, it's this is what we need to do. And actually balancing our work and our other parts of our life, I'm able to be a board trustee. We're at the school gates, we can pick up our children, we talk to other people in our community, and we get an insight into the world that you don't necessarily get if you're just head down working Monday to Friday. We've brought together two networks, but when we started working together, we had 14, 15 years work experience behind us, two networks that we could bring together. We find that if somebody says, if Claire says, well, we need to chat to you about something, even if they've never met me, the fact that we're in a partnership means they're happy to have the meeting with me rather than Claire and vice versa. Is the pace as well. I think we find that two people in one role can maintain a pace through the week that you can't necessarily get with one person. We've dealt with over the last 2 years both Brexit and COVID, and now both of them together. And apart from the fact that we have children to deal with now, we were able to keep up that level of energy and to keep pushing through and to work over the weekends because it's only every other weekend. And on a personal note, when I take, as a senior leader, when I take a holiday, I properly take a holiday because Claire takes the phone, she deals with the inbox. There's very few people who can actually switch off in the way that we can because there's two of us. We have different strengths and we play those strengths sometimes. So we know that there are people who will respond better if Claire suggests something or if I suggest something, and we use that to our advantage. And in terms of managing our team, we also have learnt which style of management is better to get the best out of which type of person. And so we flex that as well. And there is, you know, one of the ways in which we managed to secure our new job, we started off being quite defensive and trying to explain all the reasons why job sharing was okay to everybody. And we got to the final round of an interview process for a senior position in a household name charity. And in the final interview, the chief executive said, but if I want to fire you, Hannah, but I don't want to fire Claire, how will that work? And it was so frustrating that we've got so far on in that process that they were still asking basic questions around the job share. So we didn't get that role, and we were pleased not to have got that role, because I don't think we were going into it in the best. We wouldn't have been going into it. We would have been going into it with them thinking, how is this going to go wrong? Not how is this going to go well? And so when we started pitching out again to other roles, we started selling the benefits. We started saying why it was better and actually making a case for women in leadership. And we deliberately targeted opportunities where we felt like having a woman in that position would be symbolic and would make a difference. And so British Chambers of Commerce was a great opportunity for us. We're the first women who've ever been on the executive team in 160 years. There's 2 of us. There's now actually 3 of us. Our chief operating officer is also a woman. And it was that helped us to sell it to the recruiter. It was that helped us to sell it to the organisation. So it really is something that can really help an organisation to transform. And when we left Teach First, we left 8 other job share partnerships there. Job share is now a standard offer to people in that organisation. It's a standard offer to people at BCC. So the more visible job shares are, the more people can understand the benefits, the more of us there will be. So hopefully between all of us, we can try and change it. And my thanks to Dame Margaret and others who've gone before us and have tried to fight this corner for us, because without that, we wouldn't have been able to do what we've been able to do now.
Yeah, so true, Hannah. And I love that you've also touched on the mental health benefits. So, you know, not just the benefit to the employer of you actually being able to get your head up occasionally and see what else is going on in the real world. And I think all of us know sometimes when you're struggling with a problem, a creative problem, a financial problem, actually leaving it for a moment and coming back to it, you come at things with a different mindset, and that's when you solve things. And the whole concept of this is better for mental health as well, because you do get a proper holiday. Everybody on this can relate to the fact that we go on holiday, but our phone is still in our hand. We're always contactable. You never want to come back to the amount of emails, so you do something about it whilst you're away. So the fact that you've got somebody that you completely trust that can look after that properly for you, you know, better than any out of office you could ever do.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to just move across to Charlotte. Perhaps you could share some thoughts on this too.
Certainly. That was absolutely fascinating to hear, Hannah. What a kind of like insight into really being at the coalface of it and beyond kind of the news coverage, what it's actually been like doing it. One of the thoughts that it sparked for me was, we know that the point at which women need to have children is often the stepping away from the career and the workplace point. And we've been working at BITC around that risk being something that could almost be intensified during the pandemic because of the number of women who've been furloughed or reduced their hours in some way. And is that going to be the stepping away point? So not just the stats now, but the stats in the longer term. I wonder if there's something creative that somebody could do there around saying job shares that help women come back post-maternity, that there's an opportunity to say job shares could be about helping bring a lot of those people who stepped away during the pandemic back in. Certainly we've been talking about apply the learning that you have about returner schemes to how you bring people back from furlough. And I wonder if there's something there, just thinking about your experience there. To move on to kind of what an employer's perspective is on job shares and kind of the things that I've heard from BITC members, mainly this is drawn from a number of BITC members have staff who feature in the TimeWise Power Part-Timers list, which often includes a number of job shares. And I think last year included quite an uptick in the number of job shares. And there were 3 themes that I thought I'd share, most of which I think are pretty obvious. One was just the access to a broader skill set and experiences. 2 heads are better than 1. I think that's particularly timely in times of crisis, that at this point of kind of change and disruption, having access to that broader tool, that broader pool, I think is a great thing to be selling to employers. The second point is around the retention of top talent. From an employer's perspective, losing people that you've invested in, losing people that you've kind of helped grow and develop costs money, it's disruptive, it means you have to go through recruitment, which can be very costly. So I think presenting job shares as a cost-effective way to retain people as they progress through the organisation is something to be borne in mind. And particularly, again, during times of crisis, there's a stability element there. So I would hope that we have employers who are turning to senior women on their books who are thinking about stepping away at the moment and saying to them, I know we're in crisis at the moment, is there an opportunity for us to think about a job share at this time to help retain you in this moment? And then finally, listening to Hannah talk there, I thought was really bore it out. In my experience, and certainly sort of the few people that I know that job share, you just get an extra level of commitment, an extra level of work ethic, because people are so determined to make it work. So I just think from an employer's perspective, when you take on a job share, you take on two people who in their hearts are thinking, I'm committed to another colleague, often a friend, I really need to bring this out. I need to drive it home. And I think that's a kind of commitment and motivation that you can't always buy. And I think that's something that should be brought out a bit. And certainly that was the impression I got from when you were talking about Hannah, of just kind of a determination to do the very best that you could. So those are some perspectives in terms of where an employer's head might be in terms of the benefits of this and why I think it's particularly timely. Against that, two other things I just wanted to kind of share. When I was prepping for this session, I was very struck by how much both my experience, the people I spoke to, and the little bit of reading I did, how much for me, job shares seem primarily to be the preserve of mainly white, mainly middle class, mainly graduate professions. And I'm hoping that part of that is just the bubble that I'm in, but I am concerned by that for the obvious kind of reasons, but I'm also concerned because I think it risks in a climate where, as Margaret Hodge said, we have a government thinking about broadening the focus on equalities. If something is understood as kind of that preserved, how much buy-in and traction are we going to get if it's seen as just addressing, there's that concept of gender fatigue, like white women where the only barrier is your gender. If it's understood as that, I think that limits how much punch through we're going to get. So I think just really thinking about how we broaden that is a really important point. On that, one other point I wanted to add in was, we know we have an ageing workforce. We know that many employers are now dealing with teams where they have people from many different generations working together. And some of the job share kind of anecdotes I came across that I found most compelling were where there'd been people who were looking to do a staggered retirement and saying, I want to stay in the workplace for a few days, and there might be somebody coming up behind them and they would agree a job share model. And I think that those kind of slightly dynamic versions of it, where it's not two women, frankly, who look and sound like me, but actually quite a different range of people doing it, can help kind of unlock the idea for more people, and perhaps it's something we should be thinking about as well. Those are some thoughts from me.
Great, I love that idea, particularly of making it a transition thing as well, of people from different ages job sharing and different genders, so that we have all those different perspectives and different levels of experience. I think that could be amazing.
Sian, could I just come back on a couple of those points? I think commitment point is absolutely right. When you're responsible for not only your own success but somebody else's success, it does motivate you, a hell of a lot more. But I think your point on the being it preserved for white middle class women, I think that is absolutely brilliant point. And I think it's because we have agency. We have, and we had to do so much work in order to figure this out for ourselves, but we had that capacity. And also just, working part-time is a privilege because it means that you can financially afford to reduce your salary. Whereas, for women of colour tend to be in lower paid roles, and therefore that becomes more difficult for them. So I definitely think there's a kind of element of there's an issue there, and it's helping people to understand helping people to make the case for it. That's the thing that's missing. There needs to be a sort of go-to, here's how you do it, and here's the people who can support you to make the case. And that's what we do a lot of, sort of just informally, is how do you make this case to your employer? And because white women tend to have more agency, they tend to get more promotions when they ask for them. That's the challenge. It's dealing with that kind of institutional challenge as well.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah, for those added points. And I noticed, I love that pivot that you did, that when you and Claire, when you were both in your early interviews, you were more defensive, and then you kind of flipped it to be, no, let's just talk about the positives that the employer is going to receive, because the two of us are doing this rather than the one of us. We've focused quite a lot on the positive sides of job sharing. But Claire, I'd love to turn to you and see what are the negative perceptions that we need to bop on the head like whack-a-mole in a very public way so that we dismiss them very quickly for both employers and employees.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, because that will empower us if we know what the challenges are and how we can actually, contradict those challenges or overcome those perceived challenges. They're not always real, are they? And I'm sure Hannah will say a lot of these challenges actually aren't, they aren't real. But I think some of the biggest challenge, as I've said, is this just lack of awareness, lack of understanding from employers, but also from employees to be able to make that business case. But I agree also, employees need to be supported through guidance, through checklist tools in order to be able to make the case, because actually the onus is on them, as I think we've heard already. But the other challenge I think also is that job shares are associated with certain sectors and certain roles much more than others. So public sector, office-based work, education perhaps, and I think that can really limit opportunities. I know when I was on Women's Hour and I was trying to make the case to say actually there's so much potential here for other sectors, I completely got shut down. No, this is only suitable for certain, and I don't actually think that is the case at all, but the association there really doesn't help. So we need to have those examples across different roles, across different sectors, to really show that this is very valuable and can work. Some of the perceived challenges coming through from employers, I think, are potentially the need for additional supervisory time, although I would challenge that, because I think we've heard from Hannah actually that if you've got two people working together to solve problems, then actually that is probably going to be much less of an issue. Possible disruption of workflow would be another one that employers might point to. Scheduling difficulties for training and meetings. Again, I'm not sold on any of these challenges particularly, but I think these are the sorts of things employers would potentially point to. The other challenge always with flexible working, with any type of flexible working, is line manager resistance. So it's about getting our line managers on board. If they've got a perception there by a line manager, this is going to be more work, we're not going to have continuity, then that is going to be the biggest stumbling block. So I think really, really important to get our line managers on board and show them actually the benefits that this can bring to them. I know we've worked with a few organisations where they've actually got their line managers they've been piloting different ways of working, and they've got their line managers to lead on the pilots, and that has made such a difference, because the line managers are actually the biggest advocates, and they can see not only that people in their team are benefiting from this way of working, but actually they'll benefit from it themselves as well. So I think that's interesting. And then also from an employer's perspective, it might be perceptions of additional costs, more costs than one person in a full-time role, in terms of admin time, contracts, having a crossover day potentially, is extra time. But again, and I think from an individual, some of the challenges, well, first of all, I think the biggest one is finding positions that are open to job shares, which, we've discussed already. There are just very few employers are not, even if they are open to job shares, they might not be making that clear in any way in their adverts, or on their websites. And then potentially finding a suitable partner. Hannah, I know you probably could say more about that, but that would also be a challenge. You need to get the right person, to have the same kind of goals and motivations, and that you complement one another in terms of your working. Making sure that you're happy with agreeing your work hours could be another challenge. And then I think the final one is just making sure that you've got that seamless communication across job shares partners towards your colleagues, but also your customers as well. So I think those are the sorts of things that employers would be concerned about, but I think they can all quite easily be overcome, really.
None of them seem insurmountable, do they? Particularly when you consider the upside to flexible working. I wanted to come onto the Environment Bill.
Can I just come in a little bit on that, because the only thing you didn't cover, Claire, there is a real additional cost in that you've got to do 2 lots of NI and 2 lot of pension contributions.
Yes. Yeah.
So that is a real cost, and I think you've got to be open and honest about that. I mean, and then sort of try and do the benefits. And what that tends to suggest, if you really want to spread job share, it's harder. It's a bit like apprenticeships. It's much harder for smaller organisations than it is for larger. So I think we've got to do some creative thinking around that to show that we've dealt with the challenges, and not you've got to confront them openly.
Yeah, no, that's really valuable. Thank you.
Yeah, you raise a really interesting point, actually, for me, Dame Margaret, because my background is an entrepreneur in the SME space. So I've never worked in big business. I'm very aware from where people are working, where people are coming from. It tends to be bigger business that are using the job sharing rather than the smaller SMEs. And yet, in some ways, SMEs are always that's where change starts in different kinds of ways of employment or working conditions. So is there a way, do we think, that the government can perhaps support flexible working, a little bit like the apprenticeship schemes? Is there something that we could really be pushing for with some kind of grant or financial support so that SMEs can adopt this too?
I mean, I honestly just don't think it needs a grant or financial support. In terms of priorities for that, I think it needs much more promotion, acceptance. I mean, if you had a job share MP, that wouldn't be a bad thing, would it? You know, it's having those sort of role models that you can look at. And I think it's the open. I mean, I was very interested in that 0.5% of people in job share. I mean, you know, I didn't know that, and I'm somebody that's sort of vaguely interested. By the way, don't call me Dame Margaret, because it's one of the things that goes. So I'm just Margaret, but I'm just somebody who's interested in this issue, and I should have known, and I didn't. So I sort of feel those are the sort. I'm not sure it's an area where, I don't know if Caroline disagrees with that. I don't think it's an area that requires financial incentives. I think it's more an area that requires sort of promotion and exposure rather than financial incentives. I don't know, maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe I haven't thought of something.
Is there also more we can do with the employment bill? I'm coming to you, Caroline, on this. That
so
the employment bill is saying, sorry.
I think Margaret's absolutely right. It needs promotion. It needs wider understanding. The 0.5% stat is very stark indeed. Do you know, I think you could make a case within the employment bill for some sort of tax break. So not a direct grant to small businesses, but something that, when you look at some of the programs that have gone on through the coronavirus job retention scheme, you know, there's been all sorts of grants dished out to small businesses to say, keep this person. I actually think if you could look at some, maybe just a small percentage reduction on that effectively double national insurance would act as an incentive. And of course, if you include something like that, and I'm conscious the budget's coming up, so if you include something like that in the budget, it suddenly becomes very high profile, which provokes people into talking about it. As I've said repeatedly, and I get really boring on this subject, we are seeing women's employment shoot backwards at an alarming rate. And I know that job share is for men as well as women, but actually, if you were to have some sort of high profile, very small, doesn't have to be big money, and every time I get any communication from the Chancellor, he tells me I'm to stop giving him shopping lists that are very, very expensive. But something like that, that actually we know there wouldn't be huge take up, because we can see that job share is such a tiny, tiny proportion of the market, but it becomes very totemic, doesn't it? It's a government that's saying, hang on, we want to help people work more flexibly. We recognise that we've all learned different ways of working during the pandemic. Let's just give a little nugget, a tiny nugget, to make business think, actually, as an SME, we can do this. Can I just, completely off topic, John said something a while back about job share was much more likely to be in the public sector, civil service, etc. I'm going to tell you something really terrifying from my time at the Cabinet Office, when we had what I thought was a brilliant programme about not apprenticeships, but returnships. So enabling people who had taken career breaks to come back into the workforce, providing them with support, retraining, etc., to bring their skills up to where they needed to be. I left the Cabinet Office. 6 months later, I found myself sat back in the Cabinet Office on an employment task force, talking about all sorts of issues. And I've no idea why I was there. But I suddenly had this flash of inspiration. And I looked at John Manzoni and I said, how's the returnship programme going that we were so proud of? He went, oh, there's 4 across government. I went, hang on, 6 months later, you've got 4. And he went, yes. And 3 of them are in the Government Equalities Office, at which point I was just to be found beating my head against the table. And he looked and went, oh, yes, we've missed you. But, you know, it's one of those awful things, isn't it, that actually, even when you think that the public sector and the civil service will lead the way in something, even they are capable of exhibiting the most tiny, tiny changes, or I would even argue, backwards attitudes to, oh, well, if we're going to do this funny little returnship thing for people who've taken career breaks, we'll poke them all into the Government Equalities Office.
Classic. I wanted to come back to the employment bill. I wonder if this is a catalyst. Is this the moment? John's idea of opt out. Wouldn't that be something that would really, I think, create a lot of buzz and attention in the same totemic way that you're saying if there was some kind of tax break for job sharing? What does everybody think about that?
I think I can offer a thought on that. I think much in the way of
Can't hear you, Charlotte.
oh
Yeah, wait.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, you're a bit in and out. I think.
Sorry, I'm not sure if that. Can you hear me okay?
Better, great.
I guess I just wanted to offer two thoughts on that. One thought was much of the progress that we've seen in the past few decades around a kind of shifting labour market and a more progressive model. What we and others, the CIPD and co have been trying to do is to shift the onus on employers to make the case for saying why we want to work in an old school way, as opposed to the onus on applicants or employees around why we want to work in a progressive way. And so for me, the idea that you kind of could tick a box to say we're opting out of job shares, for me, the bigger attraction would be tick a box to say you don't want to do flexible working by default, tick a box to say you don't want to offer kind of pay transparency by default, like almost, I don't know that job shares for me hold enough reach to be the thing that I would choose, to be the bit that employers had to choose to opt out of. And I wonder if flexible working might be the kind of stepping stone towards it, would be one thought. The other thought on it is, I do think, as much as we've talked about job shares needing to be available to all, if we were to make that, or if one was to make that as a kind of big pitch for the budget or the like, I think it would be perceived as supporting a very small strata of society at this point, unless we could find some very clever way of positioning it. It would be about giving support to a group of people that kind of, can afford to do, as others have said, automatically can afford to take a pay cut, which we know many, many people can't. And then just a final point on the employment bill, and I think others around the room will know this better than me, and Caroline, I'm very much looking forward to seeing what your committee recommends. But for me and BITC, what we're trying to say is there have been all these issues that have held women back in the workplace for however many generations. The cards have been thrown up in the air because of the pandemic. Let's build back better by design and have that when those cards fall back down, some of those old shibboleths about flexible working, about where you do work, about presenteeism rather than outputs, let's just eliminate those, and let's have the economy bill, the employment bill is an opportunity to both kind of stave off that backwards progress that we all know is happening, but just hit the accelerator in terms of kind of taking this moment of change, out of disruption comes opportunity, etc., to really kind of push forward. So for me, love the idea of a tick box, but would love it to be bigger than job shares.
Caroline, did you want to add anything to that?
Sorry, no, I just completely wanted to agree with what Charlotte said about, the cards being chucked up in the air, and when they land, we just have to rebuild from there, as opposed to letting any of the old prejudices stay. And sometimes I suffer from being too much of a radical. Doesn't go down terribly well in my party. But we can't, I really strongly feel that if we just try and go back to the same old, and I look at sort of the pandemic response where there's a focus on construction and shovel-ready projects. And oh my God, we have to talk in this really old-fashioned language of build, build, build. Don't stop and think about how you can create new infrastructure. You're just going to build the same old, and we can't afford to do that.
Thank you.
I don't disagree with anything Charlotte said. So this is not a party political point in any way, but I think the absence of women in the core decision making throughout this pandemic has been really obvious, and you've seen it many times where announcements have been made and then sub announcements have to quickly be done because people like Caroline and others have jumped in and said you haven't thought about this and you haven't thought about relating to women. So the announcement that you can only meet up with one other person, and a few hours later announcing, oh, but preschool children are exempt from that because somebody from the backbenchers had raised the fact that actually for women on maternity leave, that's a lifeline and it's really important for them to have. There's a number of examples of that where you just see women. I've raised in a number of meetings concerns with both the government and with the opposition around the challenge of women. The jobs that are being lost are traditionally female professions. The jobs that are being created are traditionally male professions, and doesn't seem to be any connect between that. So while I agree with Charlotte that actually a small job share incentive it only hits a small number of people, there has to be some recognition that comes through that actually this pandemic has hit women economically worse than men, and there is something that we want to do about it. And what we found with job sharing is that if you have job shares, particularly job sharers in senior positions in organisations or in HR positions in organisations, that can lead to a culture change around flexible working that goes beyond the job share. So, you know, in our team at Teach First, we had 30 people, we had 25% of people on some sort of flexible working arrangement. And that was because people knew that they could ask us, they knew we would be open to it, they knew that it was part of the way that we did things. So I think even if it's something is in some ways symbolic or seen as tokenism, actually, if it starts a conversation, it starts a culture change and leads to more, then I think that's a good thing. And I would, we'd be supportive of a sort of tax incentive. We cost the organisation, our salary is 20% more than it would be if we were an individual person. There's the additional on cost. There's the, two seats at the Christmas party if you ever get to have one of those again. There is an additional cost. So some things that it says to employers, but by the way, you get this kind of, there's a little bit of an incentive here for you, I think would be really helpful.
Thank you. And you'll probably have noticed that John just popped in the chat there that 80% of all job shares are currently with women. So it is still seriously weighted there.
Can I just pick up on what Hannah said about women being excluded from the decision-making process, because she is absolutely right. And what was really obvious was when the Prime Minister was in hospital, the Quad was all male. When we had the summer economic statement, there was no reference to childcare whatsoever. The first lockdown, informal childcare was outside the regulations. And it just, as I said in the chamber back in the summer, this is, and at the time I was talking about recovery, but it was a recovery designed by men for men. And that's something that every opportunity I get, I ram that home. I become this sort of lone, boring, angry voice in the Tory party. And sporadically when journos phone me up and say, oh, Caroline, did you want to comment on this? I go, oh God, does it have to be me? And then when it becomes apparent that it's not going to be anyone else, I go, yes, then I do want to comment on it, because it does have to be someone. And I just feel like I'm beating my head against a brick wall at the moment, that we have a women, and I will say this about Liz Truss, we have a women and equalities minister who isn't interested, doesn't want to do the job, hates the job, I think it would be fair to say. Her second in command, Kemi Badenoch, the equalities minister, makes it perfectly clear she is a treasury minister first, and she regards the equalities job as an inconvenience to her. And you end up in a situation where, despite having a much larger female presence in the Conservative Parliamentary Party than ever before, you still have fewer women sat around the cabinet table. You're only ever allowed to see Priti Patel at the daily press conferences. Now, I don't care who's presenting the message. I really don't. I can't get hung up on that. I care that there is no woman to feed in to the daily message. Sorry.
No, thank you, Caroline, because I can't tell you how much I agree with you. In my environmental work, I don't know if anybody noticed the original COP26 panel, which was completely male, not a single woman represented on one of the, a global world stage event for the UK in November this year, not a single woman on the UK panel. So we've been involved, and in fact, Higginson Strategy have been very involved in trying to right that wrong, because just as with COVID, and women are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, women are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis too. And for us not to have a seat at the table for the UK panel just seemed absolutely ridiculous. So keep doing what you're doing, Caroline, please. Keep speaking to the media, be that spokesperson.
It just all demonstrates, doesn't it? You can never take your foot off the accelerator.
Absolutely.
I think there had been progress made on that, and we're going backwards. And the only other thing I wanted to add in this issue is, should we have a tick box on job share, or should we have one on flexible working? It's not an either or, so it can be a both and you could quite easily devise something that covers both. So I don't think we should do that. And then the third thing, which I'd be more, because Caroline's more in touch with it, is, the important thing on the upcoming bill. We may end up getting hugely defensive And I know that Caroline's talking to Harriet because I've talked to her about some really good ideas that we could put in. But we should, you too, I mean, out of today, maybe one should come and say, so what are the priorities that we want to put into that bill that would take this whole agenda further? And where do they lie? Where do they lie? I mean, is it around, I think this sort of issue, flexible working from day one, that you shouldn't have I think that's a really interesting idea that maybe, Caroline, we ought to think about. Very easy change, which won't, you know, we can demonstrate from the introduction of flexible working won't have any impact at all on business success. Where is it? And it's a question really to the rest of you as well.
I think on flex on day one is you know, should be standard. I think the challenge is that, and particularly for SMEs, is they don't understand what that means. So there's been a lot of talk, you know, there was a report, forgive me, I can't remember whose report it was, but I think it was earlier this week or last week, around the number of jobs that are being published, advertised as remote working, and people saying that's now that is a great success. People have proved that working from home is possible. You can be highly productive and still work from home in those jobs where that is possible. But that isn't in itself flexible working, and there's flexible working covers a whole, you know, myriad of things, including job sharing. And so I think that alongside the stick, you also need more of the carrot and more of the sort of visible successes of flexible working. And, you know, how do you do shift patterns and allow for flexible working? Now, is possible, but you need to help people to see how you can do that. So to encourage people to do it, they need to see the examples. They need to know how to go through the process, not just on job sharing, but on flex as a whole.
Can I just say on that, I'm not sure on the first thing, I think SMEs are quite often better at flexible working than large organizations. Certainly that was my experience when we were implementing the original regulations around flexible working. Because if you're in a small business and somebody suddenly has a baby and you want to hang on to their, onto their skills and talents, you find a way of making it work, which you don't think of as flexible working, but in effect is. So I think ironically on flexible working, I think SMEs have a lot of good practice which they could share. That's the first thing. And the second thing, it's probably gone now, but it's quite easy to just have really good award systems, you know, which cost a pittance, but do a lot to help us celebrate and share best practice and promote the spread of good practice. And I think it's rather sad that those things aren't as prominent today. You know, they're one of the things that were cut in the early days. They just are they don't cost anything, but they just do a lot in helping to spread more progressive systems.
So can I just add as well? So I mean, interesting around the day one and the kind of the consultation, if it comes through from the government, is about making flexible working the default position. But from our research with our employers, they absolutely do not understand what the default position is. It's very confusing to them. I think it would be extremely difficult to pin that down in legislation. What we need is two-way flexibility, and what we might get is just employers expecting employees to be flexible, i.e. through 0-hour contracts, or, you know, and not actually employers being flexible and then saying that they are default flexible. So I think our position is, if we go with what we've already got, which is the right to request, which is something that employers do understand, and actually our employers have said, I think we've got about 45% who said they think it's been really effective in increasing flexible working in their organisation. We have 50% who are saying they would consider right to request requests after the pandemic. They'd be more likely to consider it following the pandemic. So it feels like that making that a day one right would have much more bite, and employers would find it much more, you know, understandable. So for us, it's that in terms of the employment bill would be a great sort of step forward. But then there are all sorts of things that employers can do, which doesn't necessarily, you know, need a shift in legislation. So you know, tagging job adverts, you know, happy to talk flexible working, I think is really helpful. I also think, you know, possibly in terms of job shares, if they're larger organisations, they could set up some job share sites on their intranets to help facilitate job sharing. As Hannah said, getting out those examples of job shares, you know, is really important. Role modelling those to people, making use of pilots. I mean, I mentioned this before, but it's so powerful for employers. You know, with home working, so many said there's absolutely no way we can facilitate this, and now they know that they can. So actually trying things can make a really big difference. And I think support for line managers in knowing how to manage people, how to manage flexible workers, how to facilitate that, and then also for employees themselves, because there is still so much onus on that. It's about having really strong guidance. And I think Hannah again mentioned this, having toolkits, having, you know, templates that they can use in the right to request, so that they feel confident to make those requests. They understand the pros and the cons of job shares, and they're able to put a really strong business case in. So I think it's, you know, there's legislation, there's things that employers can do, there's things that we can do to support employees as well to make a big difference around job sharing and flexible working more generally.
Just to come in at the back of that, thanks very much. It's really helpful, Claire, to have you remind us of the kind of risks of flexible working can work in different ways, and there are organisations and employers that might exploit it in the wrong way. To follow up on that, I also think it's worth us noting that remote working and the move to kind of hybrid flexible working, there is an emerging concern that we might see lots of employers say, well, yes, we're going to do hybrid, we're going to be flexible. And that translates into women staying at home and then going into the office. And in fact, the CMI have warned that might see a kind of locker room culture in the office. So I think it does come with those caveats. To give just a very quick kind of BITC perspective, we around International Women's Day are going to be publishing our version of kind of the gender equality roadmap at work for the future, fit for kind of the new environment. As part of that, we're going to be working on some stretch questions for employers. So we're a bit biased towards kind of larger employers who perhaps are in this space quite smug about how good they think they are on gender equality, and that tends to be, I don't have as much engagement with SMEs or kind of startups and the like, but of those that are quite progressed and regularly make our kind of top 50, the areas where we're going to be pushing them, we think at this point, will be around flexibility by default, with all of the caveats that Claire and others have mentioned. So beyond the kind of right to request, but actually saying the onus is on you to explain why this job shouldn't be flexible rather than the employee to request it. Pay transparency, which I think is an idea whose time has really, really come, particularly in the context of if we are going to be split, that ability to understand and see, if you're not in the office, what others are earning, whether somebody's had a bonus. We think there's a real risk that we kind of retreat back into being extra discreet about pay transparency, and that's something I really want to say to people who are saying to us, we're excellent. I want to say, well, does everybody in your organisation know what different people earn? And then finally, parental leave pay. I think all of us at different points have talked about and worked in the past around the need to have appropriate remuneration for all genders. The vast majority of employers still say caring in the home is a woman's job. And we're going to be saying you want to do best, you want to do better in the context of what caring has meant in this pandemic, pay men and women the same when they're looking after their kids. And so for us, those are some stretch areas that don't necessarily fit with the employment bill, but will be the dialogue we'll be trying to have with some of the big employers.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for that wrap up. And I know we've taken up a lot of your time today. I had a final thing, if anybody's got a moment, that I wanted to whistle around the room, just to add or end on a kind of a personal note. If all of you could just let us know one thing that scares you about the future, and perhaps one thing that excites you. And Caroline, let's start with you, because I know you've got to go.
So I tell you what really scares me about the future. And I always tell people that my mother fought battles in the 1970s, so I didn't have to now. And that was me being terribly complacent, because I now find that I'm fighting the battles that I don't want my daughter to be fighting in 20 years' time. And it scares me that she still will be. The thing that I think is really positive is that I think we have seen women become really empowered during the course of this pandemic. They've recognised the challenges that we're facing and are determined to find ways to work together to come out of it in better shape. And that gives me some hope. I think we've got a battle on our hands, and I think, and it was Hannah that said it, the government's still not listening to female voices. And the thing that really strikes me is that the last 12 months have made me much better at making sure that I build alliances across parties, within parties, to make sure that we can affect change, which I think, you know, that gives me a hell of a lot of hope.
Great.
I must fly. I'm due somewhere else at 12:30.
Thank you so much for all your time. Bye-bye, Caroline.
Nice to talk to you.
Go fight the fight. Charlotte, do you want to dip in now?
Sure. So the thing that excites me and the thing that scares me.
Yeah.
Thing that excites me, jobs, shibboleths, expectations, they've all been thrown up to an extent. And I think that's quite exciting. I think stuff that I'm having conversations with people that I previously thought might happen in 5 years. Thing that scares me, I know in my privilege, 2-parent setup, have thought, can I really do this job whilst I've also got a toddler? And I know so many of my friends have thought that, and I just think there's just a real risk that a lot of women, just their sheer resilience at this point, we're just tired and exhausted. And if I'm feeling that, how are some of the people who aren't as privileged as I'm feeling? And I'm very scared that in a year's time, we might see a really dramatic drop in women's employment.
Yeah, let's hope not. Thank you so much. Claire.
Yeah, I'll do it the other way around so I can end on a positive. I think the thing that scares me, and the only thing I can think about, unfortunately, is the pandemic. So it's in relation to that, you know, to that longer term impact on the groups that have been most affected, you know, in society. So that inequality and the implications for that. So it's very similar to Charlotte there. But for me, what excites me is that I am seeing some employers for the first time understanding the personal responsibilities that people have. You know, they've had to talk to them about vulnerable members of their household. They might have caring responsibilities. They might be parents. They might have sadly been bereaved. And, you know, I think there's a really big opportunity there for organisations to build compassionate approaches to really support their people. And I'm seeing that coming through, and I just hope that continues. But there's an opportunity there to be much more compassionate as a society, but as organisations as well.
I love that, Claire. You should read the Pope's new book.
I will.
About the pandemic. And
I will, yeah.
It's really interesting because it talks about the fact that this is our coronavirus. This is of coronaviruses. And if we learn only one thing, you know, I mean, the Rohingyas, what's happening in Syria, or the Uyghurs in China, all of this thing, it didn't impact us. Now this impacts us.
It impacts us, yeah.
You know, if it does one thing and it unifies humanity in a more empathetic way, it's almost been worth it. So yeah, it's a very human, very interesting book. I think you'd love it. Hannah.
Thank you, will do.
Similar themes to others. I mean, I think the thing that you know, I grew up believing that women would make progress. You know, there was still a fight on our hands around equality, but we would always make progress. It would always get better. And I think the last 4 years, when you look at what happened in America, you look at what we've talked about around women in decision making. You know, women belong in the rooms where decisions are being made, and that doesn't always play out anymore. And I feel like we're taking many steps back. But the thing that gives me hope is one, that the pandemic has proved that we can work in different ways and hopefully open some minds that have previously been closed to different ways of working. But two, that every time I see a glass ceiling being shattered, it gives me hope. So the inauguration yesterday, Madam Vice President, warms my heart, fills me with joy, and gives me hope that even if we get these setbacks, that will lead to actually, that motivated women to get out there and to fight. It motivated women to organise and to nominate and to stand for office. And if it can, you know, if that's happening, then maybe that will also happen here, and we'll get voices like Caroline's much more higher up in government of whatever party, fighting the corner for women, and all women of colour in particular, to actually make progress in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. Well, you've given us an unbelievable amount of your time. For me, personally, it's been incredibly interesting to listen to all of you great experts on this particular topic. I've learned so much. I just want to reassure you, Empower is not a think tank. It's not a talking shop. We're about action. We're about campaigning. We're about making change happen. So I would love us to consider this a springboard. And if we can support any of you in the actions that you're taking, then we are here for you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you all. Thank you.
Lovely to meet you all, yeah.
Bye.
Bye.